Hi everybody, welcome to the Gaming Careers panel this afternoon. As you may know, the games market is a rapidly growing industry with millions of people worldwide playing games on various platforms and billions of dollars in revenue generated every year as a result. Now, when we refer to the video games market, we're talking about the entire industry. So that really is involving the creation, the development, the publishing, distribution, marketing, monetization of video games. So as you can see, there are likely to be a wide range of work possibilities within this area. So as part of the Creative Careers Festival this year, we wanted to highlight just some of the more creative related roles that you may like to consider and look into further. So those really that aren't purely technical in nature, but have more creative element to them. So we've brought together a panel of people in just some of those roles today to give some insight and some inspiration as to what the possibilities for a career in this industry might be. So we're delighted to have with us George Adamson, who's a 3D character artist, and she works for EA. We've got George Lockett, who's a senior writer for Failbetter games. Xiaotian Shi, who's a composer for TV, film and games. And Tim West, who's a principal animator for Frontier Developments. My name's Jane Ansell. I'm a career consultant here at the Career Service, and my colleague Catherine Alexander is in the background helping manage any queries or questions that you might have. So please do pop those in the chat. Just a little bit about the format of the session. Each panelist today will have just a few minutes to talk a little bit about themselves, their background, their current role, and hopefully you've had a chance to read through their biographies as well, so you know a little bit about them. But then I will put some questions to the panel as a whole, but also to some questions to the individual people, and we can have a bit of a discussion around those. And then it'll be your turn in the audience to ask some questions yourself. So please feel free at that point to either unmute if you're feeling brave to ask the question, or you can pop it in the chat and we'll be very happy to read those out for you. So I think that's enough from me. I shall hand over to the panel, and if you want to just each of you just have a few minutes, 5 or 7 minutes or so, to talk a little bit about your background and your current role. Just sort of say what a typical day might be like, if there is such a thing. So I'll go around my screen. Tim, do you want to start us off and tell us a little bit about yourself?
I can do indeed. Yes, I've got to remember to unmute myself. Yeah. So I've been in the industry for about 22 years now, and in that time, I've probably held most of the roles that an animator would do. Well, there's loads of them really. From junior to principal to lead positions. I've worked on projects involving motion capture and realistic animation, all the way through to cartoony animations and are quite stylized. And both of those require quite different skill sets, really. Projects involving VR and AR, including research and development in both of those. I worked on trailers and marketing, on very technical animations for in-game animations. Yeah, so for all of those things, there's lots of different parts to all of those different roles that you can play. So taking motion capture, for example, I've worked on planning and organizing of motion capture shoots, auditioning actors for that as well. Also acting in motion capture myself, using and recording equipment for that, selecting animations that we might do on a shoot, all the way through to working into those animations and implementing in them in game. So within each little section, there's quite a few different parts to that as well. So my typical day, I suppose, these days would be producing assets for animations, in-game animations. A large part of my role is giving feedback to other members of my team. So one of the things that we spend quite a lot of time doing at Frontier is doing what we'd call a daily critique, where the team get together and share their work that they've been working on for the last day, and then we give feedback on that work. And to do that, we use a piece of software which allows us to display our work, and then we can draw on top of it and make notes, and then discuss it as a group. So one of the important parts of that is that we get together as a team, which is really good, and we can discuss ideas and problems we've had during the day, but it also gives us a chance to share ideas and And also, it's a great opportunity for people who are starting their careers to get involved and give feedback as well. So I could spend a few minutes talking about the different types of roles that there are in games, if you'd like me to expand on that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Please, thank you, Tim.
So it really, I would split it into two, really. The first area is what I would call gameplay animation. And here you've been working on games, animations that are played during the game. And these can be quite technical and quite restricted because you're trying to build a system where you're building animations which work together in order to allow a character or some kind of avatar or an NPC, a non-player character, to move around a scene and do the things that they want to do. So it might involve something like building a system where you'd have on the lower body some running animations which take you in all sorts of different directions, and those animations might be restricted on how far they can go or how fast they are, and they would all have to be in sync. And then you might layer on top of that some aiming animations if you had maybe a weapon in your hand. So they would play again in sync on top of the running animations, but they would override the upper body. And then you might have on top of that some animations which deal with injury. So you might be shot by someone else, and those animations usually play in addition to what you've got underneath you. And then you might do some facial animation on the top. So if someone's hit, they might be grimacing. So you'd have some facial animation triggered on top of that. And then on top of that, again, you might have some head looking animations, which might be a little bit more involving some animation code, which get involved with that. So they can be quite sort of technical. And a lot of the work there is to do with building systems that work together and blend from one mode to another. Then there is another area which is cinematics animation, which I would say is a lot more akin to TV and film, where you would be animating a narrative to a camera in order to advance a storyline. And that differs a lot to gameplay in that very much what you see is what you get. And it's much more acting to a camera, and you would be also considering the camera animation as well. So yeah, there it's a lot more to do with conveying acting, conveying a clear thought process for the characters, conveying your story. You would also probably be looking at doing much more high fidelity facial animation for cinematic animation. So that's a whole different skill in itself as well. And people who go down this path usually love this sort of idea of acting and narrative, and those are their passions really. So it gives you an opportunity to express that. Sometimes even the animators might be involved in developing story and even shots, depending on the place where you work. And in the past I've worked with voice actors in recording studios and with people in audio doing the sound as well. So yeah, that's really the sort of where the two separate. I think that covers a lot of the different roles for each of those two.
That's great, Tim. Thank you. That really gives us an idea of the scope of your role as well, and how far that can kind of reach and the different elements of it. So thank you for that.
Okay.
George, do you want to go next? You're next on my screen.
Sure, yes. So I started not doing games originally. So I studied classics and did 8 years in tech doing marketing and comms, and then sort of walked backwards into games from there. From there implies there was any kind of like continuity or direct line between the two, but there wasn't. But these days I'm a senior writer at Failbetter Games, and that means that basically I write words and put them into our games, which is obviously not as simple as that sounds, but like at the end of the day, that is what a big part of what writers are doing, which I think is the bit that people sort of understand more intuitively. But there's a lot more which goes into writing to games specifically, which I think people often don't get from the outside. My role right now also involves a lot of narrative design, which is a term that seems to only really exist in games in that exact way. And there's a lot of disagreement about what that actually means. But the sort of simplified version is it's making decisions, design decisions around how the story gets told and what the player's experience of that story is going to be like. Which in most other mediums, like you are making those kind of decisions, but they're often sort of solved, or there's strong defaults in TV and film, all the kind of, you usually will approach those problems in the same way, and only really deviate that from that if you're doing something intentionally experimental or different. Whereas every game, you kind of have to work that out from first principle. You know, how, like, are we using voice lines? Are we using text on a screen? Are we going to have, like cinematics, as Tim mentioned? It's a huge variety of ways of doing things, each of which have their own affordances and ways of approaching. And also means being very varied as a writer, because you can be writing that very script style cinematic thing, or you can be writing like Fallen London. One of the games I work on right now is very, very prose heavy. It's a lot more like classic sort of short fiction in some ways, and it has a lot of the affordances of that. So you can be doing sort of 3 or 4 or 5 different types of writing that require very different things on the same day. Which obviously requires a broad. You have to be able to do those things to a certain standard, but that's also one of the pleasures of it, is it's quite varied. So that's narrative design distinct from what I call story design, which is sort of making decisions about the characters and the plot and the world, which is sort of more common. I think people get more intuitively what that sort of means and looks like. Some studios will, a lot of places end up bundling writing and narrative design together, like it will be one role, kind of like mine is now. Some studios will draw a distinction between those roles and have people who are more specialized in one or the other. I think it's particularly common in AAA studios, which are the really, really big ones. But it varies. Below that, it varies throughout the industry as to what kind of scale and how many writers you have. Like at Failbetter, we have, I think we're about 18 people as a company, so very small, but we have about 5 writers, which is extremely atypical. Like it's for small indie studios, unless they're very specialized in narrative, it's very uncommon to have, well, you may have 1 or 2 staff writers, but it's usual to contract that stuff out unless you could sort of consider narrative a core competency. And then as you get to AAA, you'll have an entire narrative design department who is specialized in doing that thing and might not do any, words on the page writing. And likewise, writers who are not making those kind of decisions just because there's so much content that needs to be figured out how it's going to work and then actually written. There's also sort of this sort of narrative systems design or technical narrative design, which is sort of more about making decisions like sort of tooling for writers, like how they actually going to get words into the game. Various other things that kind of feed into the more technical side and engineering side of how narrative systems get presented to the player. That's a whole other rabbit hole I won't dig into now, but yeah. So on any given day at the moment, for instance, I might spend a bunch of time just writing words and implementing them. So that means for Fallen London, we have a content management system, which is sort of a web app, like essentially like, filling in things on the website. I will write the words somewhere and put them in there, and that will then be able to show up in the game, which is very, very fast. On other projects, it's dependent. There's you can be working with lots of different tools, and you've got to figure out some way of actually translating a script or something else into something that will appear in the game, and that can be a painful or less painful process. And part of the narrative designer's jobs can be having those conversations about making those processes less painful. I collaborate with other writers, so we do have writers' rooms where we either break storylines, we will tackle problems or that kind of thing. I will edit other people's work, and likewise, I revise my own work in response to edits. Some stuff that is, I think, less typical of writers, but it can be part of this sort of portfolio, which I do, which I think is more on the narrative design and technical narrative design side, which we might be talking to programmers about, like the writer's technical needs for the project. So like we might need to be able to make a character walk around like this, and obviously if the animations exist, it might be a case of like we need the hooks so we can use whatever scripting tool we're using to actually make that happen in the context of the writing. So after they say this line, they're going to do this, and enabling the writers to do that directly rather than having to send a long laundry list of things to a programmer. Or we need to be able to write content that only displays when the player is carrying a meerkat, right? Something that's like, we need a condition where we can get something about the game state and use that to affect what content is displaying. Or like I said, on the tooling side, it might be, we click this button 5,000 times a day when we're writing. It'd be really nice if it were bigger so we didn't have to hunt it's like a facetious example, but that's the kind of thing that can form a part of this in terms of thinking about how words get into the game, like beyond the process of sort of actually making up stories and writing them down. Similarly, like we work a lot with artists, which might be giving them formal briefs in some cases, but it might also just be sharing materials back and forth. And we've got a character brief, they've gone away and actually concepted this character, and we go, okay, cool, we can change all of these things we've written because what you've done is way better. Or likewise, like we sort of triangulate towards a thing where we're each making decisions and they have to be aligned, but there's room for both groups to iterate and kind of move towards something that's maximizing the value of both. It's always great when you get given, an artist shows you something, you can delete entire paragraphs because you realize, that their picture is literally doing that work for you, and it looks much better than having, a paragraph of description somewhere. There's also lots of sort of important but necessary sort of games making admin that I think everybody here is probably involved in some degree, which will be working with source control, which is making sure we can all work on the same stuff without breaking it, or just filling in task tracking and this kind of thing, which is, I think, important to emphasize that is part of the day-to-day, and you're not sort of magically sitting around and making up stories and doing nothing else. I think that is like the extremely potted, like, what is it like to write to games on a day-to-day basis?
Brilliant. Thank you very much, George. And you just talked a little bit about artists, so we'll move swiftly on to Georgia.
Hello. Oh, sorry. Do you reckon we could go to Xiaotian quickly and then come back to me? Sorry.
Of course. Yeah, no, it's absolutely fine. Shasha, do you want to tell us a bit more about your role in your day-to-day?
Yes, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Xiaotian. I compose music for film, TV, games, all sort of things, also orchestras. So I had a very classical background. So I started playing the piano when I was 5 years old. I dreamt to be a concert pianist most of my childhood. And then I had a role in working for another composer at the time who needed orchestrator and arranger. So that kind of hit me as someone I would like to admire to be. So I ended up having my first gig around 13, 14 years old, working for a TV show. I think someone who's trained classically, there's often people asking, how does that skill transfer, having been able to play the piano or understanding orchestration or understanding musical theory, how does that transfer to working in the media industry, which includes film, TV, and games? And I feel that understanding the writing for different instruments and writing for different musicians is really important in terms of adapting to um, their strength. And for example, I work with a singer called Hannah for over 10 years. We met when I was studying at the Royal Academy of Music. And sometimes these kind of relationships, working relationship, takes a long time to nurture. In this case, I was basically invited to a BMI, which is a music licensing and royalty collection agency, to meet various artists, and I got in touch with this singer. Sometimes you never know how these relationships, collaborations can lead you. And at the time, I was very keen to work with the singer. We worked on various tracks in a classical style and sometimes in a media style. And over the years, as a composer, you always work in different type of music. So for media, there's not only for writing for TV shows and film and games, which are specific briefs and commissions. There's also opportunities for briefs from production musical libraries, because there's so many needs currently, and music is consumed so much more than before. So production music is a outlet for a lot of the composers' musical ideas. Every day I wake up, I sit on the piano, get a load of ideas down, and most of the time I write things that I feel that can survive the day-to-day evaluations. I save them, and with libraries, I get some commissions. So we had some kind of operatic collaborations over the years with different production libraries. So this is just one example of one singer in particular I worked with over the course of 10 years, just kind of having briefs for classical oriented projects. And end of last year, I had a brief very quickly in the morning. Usually, when I wake up, the first thing I check is whether I have any quick deadlines or very quick turnarounds, anything that's used. I've had one project. I had a call at 11:30 in the morning for adverts for Duracell, and I was approached by the agency. Okay, hi Xiaotian, would like to work on some music for us. Deadline pretty quick. I said okay. As how quick is it? 3:30 today. So I had about 3.5 hours for. Luckily, had about only 30 minutes of music, but we had to be fully orchestrated, fully arranged, recorded. It was a mad day for that particular project. Usually it's all briefs, so that one was quite tight. And luckily, I ended up getting the project, and it was on air and had millions of views. So end of last year, in this particular singer I worked with for many years, although it has been quite a long collaboration, we've never had really something that had a big audience. So I had an opportunity to pitch for a project for Domino's. So I got the singer over, recorded some ideas. And that's just before the weekend when I recorded. I basically wrote down the lines I have to record. Got her over on Monday to record, and over the weekend she asked me, "Hi Xiaotian, would you be able to send me some demos so I can practice the lines for her to sing?" Um, that was an hour after I was briefed, so of course I had nothing prepared. So I basically told her, "Okay, Hannah, you have maybe a couple of hours before the recording session on Monday because I'm writing the music during the weekend." So this is just one example when things get so tight and when you have so many people involved in music, not just a composer sitting behind the screen writing music. It involves so many different steps: orchestration, arrangement, writing the music down, getting the sheet music prepared, and then of course recording live musician involves so many um, people such as conductors. If you working in tight deadline, there could be orchestrators involved. But in this case, it was just me with the singer, with the weekend of preparation on the music. And that project took about 2 months from start to finish with various pitching processes. There were about 10 other composers, 20 other composers pitching in the process in the brief. Luckily, it went our way and the music was live on air. Um, but I think my point is that a working relationship with a singer or a musician, an artist, takes many, many years to build and many, many years of trust building so that I can deliver music on time and deliver the brief that caters to the visions of the directors or game developers. And another game, for example, I worked on called There Is No Game, Run Dimension. That's a independent game developer. So that game came about when I stumbled across the first game randomly with my partner online, and we really enjoyed the game and sent them an email, say I really like the game. Is it possible check out my showreel? And 2 years later, after many months of nurturing, he was really keen to in working with me, and so I ended up working on the game with him for over a year and a half. That game, I think, is one of the more special one to me, especially there's one track in the game. There were about 100 million views just on the soundtrack alone, with many different covers of different singers and different arrangements of it. And there's one even alarm clock version and extended 2-hour version. I feel like I've hit the jackpot as a composer. Sometimes it's quite rare to have acknowledgement like that. And I feel like it's really quite special that composers will live for these kind of moments, that to have some kind of acknowledgement, and it just pays off the years of dedication and writing to picture and writing with directors just to cater the vision. And I just feel that I'm really lucky to be able to do something I loved to do when I was a kid, and especially playing games and playing the piano were two of my favorite things, and I'm able to do that as a career. That's pretty special to me.
Absolutely, that's fantastic, Xiaotian. And it just shows the collaborations really coming through, how you all collaborate with so many different people, and that kind of works towards the end product. And those relationships are all important. And as you said about nurturing them, which we'll come on to a little bit later. Georgia, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background and what you do?
Absolutely, and so sorry for skipping just then. I've just got some background noise, so just let me know if it gets distracting or something. But it was brilliant to hear about everybody's creative experiences, because even though we all have such different job titles and we work in such different sort of departments of the process, it's interesting that we're all facing such similar problems, and we also have similar processes day to day and things like that. So I can start at the beginning. So I actually had a creative background in figure painting, and I was really interested in character design, and I decided that I would be able to try and make art into my career. So I really wanted to turn art into my career, but I wasn't sure if fine art was really the route that I wanted to go down, because that was my background and that was what I was focusing in. Because fine art as sort of a career is quite it felt quite risky to me. So I started researching different options that were available to me, and I came across the idea of actually studying animation. So I went to study animation as a bachelor's, and I discovered within my first year of studying animation that I'm really rubbish at animating. I'm absolutely terrible at it, and I should perhaps decide to change my degree. So because the type of degree that I did had several different courses under the umbrella, it meant I tried a couple of different things, and I decided that game design or game character design fitted my background and my skills a lot better, so I was able to switch that. So after graduating as a character artist, I got my first start in the industry working on a game called Old School RuneScape for Jagex, which is based in Cambridge in the Science Park, for any of you who are Cambridge based currently. And that was a really great experience for me, because even though Old School RuneScape is a massive IP and it's a huge game that has loads of players, at the time the team was very, very small. So I was able to take control of a large portion of the process, even though I was just a junior at the time. So I was doing my own concept art. I was working with essentially the developers / like the coders of the game were also the narrative designers. Everyone wore multiple hats in that. Like when you have 20 people, everyone has to wear a lot of different hats. So the coders tended to write the story of what was going to happen for the quest, and then I would speak to them, and we'd get an idea of what characters we needed, and I would get sort of a description. So like George was saying, you know, you work with the narrative designer and you have a description of the character, you come back to them with an image of how you're interpreting it, and then you decide collaboratively together if that's what you want or not. So that was the process that I was working with at Jagex, and ultimately I think I worked there for nearly 3 years before I moved over to Fall Guys, which is a much more up-to-date game than Old School RuneScape. Old School RuneScape would be classed as retro gaming. Fall Guys is a bit more closer to what we'd expect, like AAA, like up-to-date software and stuff like that. And then since Fall Guys, so Fall Guys, if you don't know, it's sort of a big online multiplayer party game where it's like a total wipeout course and you're trying to knock each other off, and you get to dress up and wear cute cosmetics. So I was responsible for making the cosmetics, and because it was a much bigger team, my role sort of laser focused into just doing 3D costumes. And I really enjoyed that, and I learned a lot from that process. But I was there for about 3 years, and now I'm at EA, and I've been here for 1 week exactly. So I can't say too much about what I do at EA. I'm working on The Sims 4, and I'm working in the Creator Sim department. So that's things like hairs and outfits. And I'm assuming that it's going to be maybe a blend of both roles, because it's a much smaller team again, but overall it's like a massive company. Like EA is a very big company. For people who might not understand what I'm talking about when I say that I'm a character artist, if you imagine if you took a ball of clay and you pulled the ball of clay out until you had, you know, like morph, like a little clay figure. That's what I do essentially, but it's completely online. So I'll take a ball of clay and I'll pull everything out, and I'll use sculpting tools, but they're digital. So digital sculpting tools to create the design of the character that I'm after. And then that sort of goes through various optimization processes. It gets a skeleton put into it, which is what we call a rig, to pass on to the animators, and then it'll be animated and it'll end up in game that way. So that's my role as a character artist. I'm so sorry if there's background noise. I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. There isn't at all, really. That's great. Thank you, Georgia. That's really lovely to have that kind of insight already into each of your roles and what you do. I'm quite interested to know a little more about when this is to all of you. So when you were aware that gaming might be an option, because obviously it's a huge industry out there, but I'm not sure how many people realise that there is such a creative element to so many different roles within that industry. So at what point did you realise or were made aware that the gaming industry could be something where you could use your skills and interests? Don't know who wants to start with that.
Yeah, I can start with that if you like.
Sure.
Yeah. So for me, working with gaming, I suppose I became interested in it quite early, actually. When I was about sort of 6 or 7, I used to play little video games in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. And my friends and I used to get graph paper out and make our own levels and design characters and things like that. So I was interested in that sort of stuff very early on. And then it wasn't till about the early 90s, I suppose, when I watched Beauty and the Beast, the Disney film, and that just captured my imagination so much. It sort of awoke me because they put in some 3D stuff into that film with the animation, and that really interested me. So I pursued that side of things for a few years, just as a side sort of hobby. And then when it came to sort of thinking about university and how my education was going to go forwards, that's the sort of thing I wanted to do. And in researching that, I found that video games was an option alongside film animation. So there was really sort of film and TV and video games, and it wasn't until then that I realized that, oh, actually I can, you know, relive this passion I had earlier for video games through my interest in 3D animation and 3D digital worlds. So that was probably when I realized it was an option, and so I sort of pursued that through a university course in computer visualization and animation. And then during that course, it became very evident to me about the options in video games, and that just happened to be where I sort of started my career, really. So I probably could have gone both ways, but I'm glad that I went the video game way, because it allowed me to use my sort of technical expertise and problem solving and interest in that side of things probably more than film would have, I suppose. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it.
Yeah, that's interesting. But George, what about you in terms of, because you said before you weren't always going to go into games.
I mean, I've always played games, like similarly since I was about 5, but I don't remember exactly when it became clear that it was a career option, but it was definitely not in my childhood at all. Like, it wasn't a thing that I remember people talking about, and even at university I don't remember it being a thing that there was no sort of visible. I feel like I had no sort of nothing that made me think about how games are made, and that might be an option, that kind of way. It didn't help that at that point I didn't know I wanted to write either. Like, I wanted to write before I wanted to write games specifically, but that all came later for me. So I graduated. I did classics. I graduated with sort of no idea of what I wanted to do with it, and kind of got a job in tech similarly because I'm like, oh, wait, this is a thing. There are jobs that exist that are non-technical in the tech industry that I can do things for, and enjoyed that for a while until I sort of stopped enjoying it. Did that for about 8 years, and it was sort of during that time that I started writing as a just because I liked it, like as a side hobby project, whatever, and had the notion to look at making that a career. And it wasn't specifically even then that I was seeking out games, but it happened. I mean, there's other stuff in my background which I can mention, which has made me good at games. It turns out, or good at thinking about how the player experience works. But it was a game for writing specifically. Games is one of the places where you can earn a salary as a writer. That's a comparatively rare thing in creative fields. Like most of them, even if you are lucky enough to get to land like the right kind of position in film and TV, whatever, like just the model in which you're working is very different, and that can be very productive. And people can have good and well paid careers out of that. But it's comparatively rare for an entertainment industry to have staff writers that they pay a salary to. Which whenever everyone talks about the stability of the game industry, there are asterisks there, particularly at the moment. But generally, it is like, historically has been stable, and for a writer that's really cool. You get to be paid to do a thing and learn it inside and out. I will say that the other thing that kind of went into it was I played a lot of tabletop role-playing games growing up. I think I started running games when I was about 10, just by default, and I never thought this would be useful. Like, I just thought this was a sort of fun and time-consuming hobby. And when I actually started trying to write games and work on games projects, I'm like, oh, okay, right. It turns out sort of 20 years of hobbyist experience in this area, even in a very chaotic way, is very useful. And that's something that I then was able to start professionalizing. I developed the vocabulary to look at the way that I've been thinking about things already, and that helped me pick that up very quickly, and that sort of fit naturally with the writing I've been working on separately.
Yeah, that's great. Georgia, did you play games before? Is that something you have you done that, and has it helped you, or have you not really been a gamer as such?
Yeah, so I think I wouldn't have described myself as a gamer when I was younger. That being said, in retrospect, I played a lot of games. I was playing World of Warcraft when Burning Crusade was released, so that was a while ago. And I played every version of The Sims from 1 through 2, 3, and then 4. I played 4, obviously. And other games, I love Overwatch, for example, but that came out while I was already at uni. So whilst I did enjoy games and I sort of had like the comprehension of it, and my family is big into board games and stuff like that, it wasn't much like the other guys, it wasn't a career path that I had specifically thought of. Because I went to uni to study animation, I was thinking film. And I have to admit that when George just mentioned about the setup of the contracts and the way that the jobs work, that was actually one of the factors that played into me switching my degree. So within like the film industry, if you're doing a job, your job will tend to last, if not as long as the film, probably more like 3 or 6 months. And then you might get your contract extended, and oftentimes you do, but it will be very rare that you'll become a full-time employee. Whereas within game studios, it's much more common to have full-time employment and be an employee of that studio working there like as a full-time. So that was actually one of the reasons that I decided to switch. And then since then, I kind of thought that I did make the right decision, because the way of working for games as opposed to film or TV, you tend to have longer, first of all, because Suicide Squad has been in development forever, like literally for maybe, I'm not even sure how long, but the last 4 or 5 years at least, and that comes out on Wednesday. So you tend to have longer, and also the optimization tends to be a bit more forgiving if you're somebody like me who has a lot of creativity and a lot of inspiration, but maybe a lack of patience. So things tend to be done faster, ironically, even though you have longer. So that's sort of what I like about working on games, and that's some of the reasons why I decided to switch, and I have stayed switched to games rather than film or TV or anywhere else where 3D is relevant.
That's great, thank you. And a few of you have already touched on, what it's like working in the gaming industry. So the way you've got those kind of tight deadlines, you've got short contracts, the collaborative nature of it, those building, nurturing relationships. When you look back, when you're at university and kind of thinking about your academic studies, your extracurricular activities, your hobbies, what you did in your spare time, are there particular activities that kind of lended themselves well to developing certain skills that you now realise you go on to use every day?
I could answer that if you like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So for me, with animation, there are definitely some hobbies and skills which I picked up at university, which helped me more, I think, than I realised at the time. So one thing that I was quite into at university was martial arts, and I was a member of a club for quite a while, and that definitely taught me a lot about things like controlling your body and timing and balance, understanding how your muscles work, sort of skills like that which you're kind of learning but kind of subtly at the back of your mind whilst you're learning these patterns. They really helped me with animation for posing, for timing, for spacing, all sorts of skills. And then secondly, I played the drums for a while when I was at university, and certainly that helped me with similar skills really. So timing, rhythm, controlling your body in a way where one part of your body needs to be separated from another, and just those kind of skills really help when you're creating an animation, to be able to act out something that you're trying to create and understand how that motion is created, control your body to do that motion, and also kind of feel and understand how that motion is represented, how you can take that motion from your own body and represent it on a character. So yeah, those two things. Oh, and dancing as well. I used to dance, do ballroom dancing. Another sort of similar sort of skill and hobby where you're thinking about timing, about patterns, about controlling your body, and interacting with another person as well. Yeah, so those three things particularly helped me with animation.
Right. Lots of musical elements there and rhythm.
Yeah.
Movement. Jansha, how about you? Because you mentioned earlier about the really tight deadlines with very little notice, and then on the flip side of that kind of long nurturing of relationships. What do you feel you've really kind of gained from those experiences that help you now?
Yes, so on the surface level, I studied at the Royal College of Music, Royal Academy of Music. During my time there, uh, beside the musical trainings of music theory, orchestration, instrumentation, what I found to be really, really useful for my career is, first of all, you have to deliver your deadlines on time, because that really is so important for your career to have that trust, element of trust, and that you can always be counted on. And also, another thing is understanding what's really needed for the assignments, and that correlates to understanding the brief of what's needed from the musics, whereas that's whether that's from a director or producer or audio director, or music supervisors, is trying to find um, the vision everyone's going toward, because you're working as a team. Instead of for a classical composer, you might be writing a symphony yourself, and you have full control of the instrumentation, who you'd like to write for, the soloist. You can even assign the director, the conductor, which venue. But for writing for media, especially writing for games and films, you're really working in a team. So especially working for games, you most likely you are hired relatively earlier in the stage of the development, rather than in, let's say, writing for brands or TV. The extreme deadline happens when you are hired right at the end, after post-production or during post-production. There are times where another composer's music might be rejected, or there are times where they realize, okay, they have more budget than just using library music. So working with on an earlier stage of the development in a game, you're really working with the directors or the writers on trying to gather the directions and what kind of music you would like to have, what kind of narrative, what kind of story you would like to tell. Then you can go into the nitty-gritties of the instrumentation, what kind of style or what kind of genre. Some vague things such as, are you looking for more symphonic writing? Are you looking for slightly more hybrid, more synthetic kind of writing with synth and sound effects? What kind of talking about sound effects, what kind of uh, sound effects are there? Are you working with the audio designers and sound designers? There's so many ways of going about getting the creative direction, and I find that once you have more time in terms of dialogue with the director or the team, you always trying to find the direction you aim to get. And I feel one thing I learned over the years is never be afraid to go back to the beginning and re-evaluate, because there has been projects where it succeeded because one of us have to back down, and usually I'm always flexible and trying to adapt to the directions. I always think it's much easier for a composer to change the music than for a story writer to change the story. You know, you can always change the music, you can always change the style, you can always change the instrumentation, you can always rewrite from the beginning. And I find during my time at university, working with different musicians, and everyone has their way of collaborating, everyone have their slight egos. You're always trying to work with the people and trying to find the way to approach them the best way. So same as working with different directors or audio designers, or head of music, head of audio. That's There's always a dialogue to be had, and it's always better to be flexible and try to understand from a non-musician perspective what you're trying to get in terms of helping the story to build or helping the game to have an impact. The music is there to serve, and I find that just be flexible and understanding the vision, so you can work as a team the best way.
Yeah, thank you, George.
That
is
resonates
anything...
as well. Sorry, yeah, no, that's like the same thing with the same thing gets put on writers, if there's any consolation, where it's often like, the writers can change the writing, and like I think it must cascade downwards. I've heard of projects where essentially like everything has been built, like here are the levels, here are the characters, here's all the designs. we would like a story, please, but you can't change the order of these things at all. Yeah, and this happens. It can become like a jigsaw puzzle where you're sort of like, okay, we've already recorded all this dialogue, but we need to rewrite this entire story beat, and we can't re-record the things. So there's definitely an element of like problem solving that isn't elsewhere, which thankfully doesn't happen too much. But definitely, like, there's a sense of, yeah, like the further things are along in a project, it's which departments are going to have to pick up the flexibility on that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. I just wanted to move to sort of individual questions now. I think I'll probably ask you one question each, just because I want to be able to get to audience questions, and the time just goes so quickly. Georgia, I'll just come to you if that's okay. In terms of what you do and in terms of your kind of day-to-day work, what would you say the balance is between the artistic, the level to which you use your artistic ability and your kind of technical know-how? Because I know you were saying before, using the analogy of using a lump of clay, but you actually do it all on the computer. So how much of that is technical, how much of it is artistic?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I was also just going to ping on the end there that that my very short answer to the question of what kind of things did I do at university that I think helped me quite a lot. For something, if you're working in games or if you're working in anything that's like creative, especially visual, pop cultural immersion is massively important. So ingesting as much media as you possibly can. So that can be reading books, reading mangas, watching animes, watching movies, like especially going back and watching older movies, things that are sort of like cult classics, just ingesting as much media as you possibly can. I think that's something that helped me a lot, that I did during university. But as for the question of my day-to-day balance, so you asked earlier about what does a typical day look like, and that's one of the reasons that I actually really love being a 3D character artist, is because I don't really have a typical day. So everything that I make is different, and I'll never really make the same thing twice, because once I've made it, it exists. So the processes that I go through are that they tend to start very, very creative, and then towards the end, so when I say towards the end, a span of creating, let's say like a Fall Guys costume. So if anyone has played like Fall Guys, or I was working for Epic Games, so you can think of Fortnite skins as well if it helps you visualize it better. So that process could take, like, let's say it takes like a week to go from start to finish. So it starts very creatively, because it'll start with a drawing, and it'll start with an idea, and then the idea will be drawn, and then so that's sort of a very creative process, because it's drawing using like a computer, so a tablet. If anyone's familiar with Cintiqs or Wacoms, that's how you're doing it, and it takes a little bit of a digital hurdle to cross from drawing on paper to drawing on a tablet, but it's kind of negligible. I'd say most people who can draw can pick up drawing on a tablet within 2 hours. Maybe that's optimistic, but it's a short process to make that transition. When it comes to 3D software, that's something that so I will get the drawing and then I'll make it in 3D. Then we're in 3D software. 3D software has a lot more controls, which you are a lot like learning to drive. So it can seem very confusing at first, and it can seem very overwhelming, and you can think to yourself, how am I ever going to get to grips with this piece of software? So imagine Photoshop, but like maybe 20% bigger, and like there's way more buttons, and everything's more confusing, and everything spins in 360 degrees. When I first started learning 3D, I actually got motion sick, because I would be spinning around in the view and I'd be like, oh, I feel sick, like this is horrible, because I hadn't got to grips with it. But once you've figured out 3D software and you're navigating completely fine, both of your hands are working together, then it's like driving. It's like muscle memory, and you can get back to being creative again. And you have that hurdle pretty much at every step of the way, I'd say, because, well, once you've learned one 3D software, learning another one, so learning a texturing software like Substance Painter or Substance Designer is not that difficult to pick up after you've got, say, Maya, which is the industry standard for 3D modeling. So if anybody's interested in modeling, Maya. If you're interested in modeling for free, Blender, which some studios actually do use professionally. So that's sort of how the technical comes in when it comes to that sort of creative portion, which is modeling, texturing, that kind of thing. And then the optimization side of things is really when you get, you know, a little bit of maths. You have to make sure that all of your quads are sort of adding up to 4s, because 4 is a bit of a magic number. 4 is a bit of a magic number in animation as well, because of, you know, you can scale it up and scale it down, and it's always going to half. So we tend to like 4s quite a lot in 3D, and especially in games. So it's nothing crazy. Like, it's all very, I'm not very good at maths, and I can do it kind of just fine. So the balance, I'd say, is probably maybe 60 creative, 40 technical. But then when we break it down into how much of my creative is like muscle memory and things that I've learned over years of using this software, maybe it looks more like 60 technical and 40 creative. So it depends how you look at it.
That's really interesting, thank you. And George, just moving on to the process of writing for games, how does that differ from writing for you know, writing a story for a book or film or TV? What's special about writing for games?
It varies. Like I mentioned before, some of this. So like I think story design is a thing that is common to all of those. Like fundamentally, if you want to tell an interesting story, if you want to create an interesting character, if you want to do all these things, there's a lot of stuff that works across multiple mediums like very, very well. And you know, there's always specific affordances that each medium has that you need to work within, but there's a lot of that is transferable. The specific stuff in games is, like I mentioned, like the field of narrative design is a thing, and it's not a given that every writer in games needs to have a high level understanding of how to do the narrative design aspects, but it really, really helps. Like you sort of want to have an awareness of how this all fits together, even if you're going to try and be more specialized and focus on doing more of the writing side of things, which is just really being able, I mean, it boils down to really being able to put yourself in the player's shoes all the time and think about how they're actually, you know, things like, you know, what are they going to be doing at the same time? Like I worked on a game a couple of years ago, and we were, one of the main sort of ways we were telling the story was through little recorded conversations in sort of, you find them around the levels, and the two characters talking, and a lot of the actual writing of those was very much like sort of core dramatic writing from other things. But we have to account for the fact that the player is solving puzzles at the same time. Like we don't want to have them stop, and in that case we didn't want to have them stop and listen to a 30-second or a minute of dialogue while just, like, you know, standing around doing nothing. This is in VR as well, so literally standing around doing nothing. But also we were aware that if that scene is competing for their attention with actual problem solving, they might just not listen to it. So there's a kind of like trying to figure out what the implications of that were for the experience, what we could do about it. So solving those kind of problems, and also being judicious, because that's a situation where you got to understand that the story might not be the main attraction at that point. So you've got to sort of work out what you can afford to do and not do. So I mean, there's lots of every single problem is slightly different in that kind of way, and that's just a very specific example. But the ability to think that way, even if you are not responsible for solving those problems, you've still got to write something that's going to show up in that kind of context. So continually sort of adjusting for that. And often you're writing stuff before the game is made, right? It's not that you get handed a finished game and then you go and put all the work. Okay, it's like I said, sometimes you do, and that's a different problem. But normally you're writing and you're having to, you know, squint and visualize what the game is going to look like. Maybe there's like placeholder textures, or there's other stuff that's like very much like, well, we haven't designed this mechanic yet. So the player is going to be doing this, but we don't know exactly what that's going to feel like. So you have to make a lot of good guesses when you're writing. And ideally, timelines are such that you can then go back and sort of do a match pass where you edit the content now that you can see it in context. And usually that's just taking stuff away, because you look at something in context and go, oh, right, cool, it's all horribly overwritten now, but now that the voice actor is saying, I can see that they can, you know, take care of this entire sentence by just changing the inflection of their voice slightly. Magic. So a lot of that kind of thing where you have to be very comfortable. I mean, I think you always have to be comfortable iterating when writing, I think, but there's a different sort of approach to it. Like I said, you also have to do a lot more stuff. Like, you know, you might be doing this is a thing that's been clicking in my mind recently is, I think a lot of people approach all writing as if it's dramatic writing, like, you know, the kind of scenes, how you do the scenes, how you do the characters. Some of games is that, but a lot of games isn't that. And a lot of people try and take writing advice that works in other mediums and apply it like a big sledgehammer to all game stuff. And actually, no, you're trying to often do something very different, which is a whole like specialist skill set. But sometimes you do want those skills, so it's a thing you've got to learn. And again, that's why I like it, is you get a lot of variety, and there's also this very specialist skill set, while a lot of that remains transferable if you want to work in other mediums as well.
There's a lot of flexibility and patience involved, isn't there, in all of the work that all of you do, and that collaboration across the different teams throughout the industry. So that's really really interesting transferable skill that is really valuable to build up, I guess. Just moving away from this sort of what you do day to day, more about sort of how you do it. Xiaotian, I know that, you know, you'll say you'll get a briefing, or you might get a commission. In terms of actually developing the work or finding those opportunities, to what extent are they do they present themselves, or have you had to go out and kind of network and really generate that work? Is it a bit of both? How does that look in terms of you developing your projects and your work?
I think it's been a bit of both. I would say maybe half of the project I work on have been proactively seeking for the positions, or briefing or pitching for different roles. It's quite rare to have these roles to be publicly advertised. So usually once you're in a position to pitch, you're already shortlisted amongst the people that you get the briefs with. And beside the briefing part, I do proactively seek directors and music supervisors, although I'm doing less of that now due to the fact that I do have a pool of people that I work regularly with. But I think it's very important to be actively seeking for contacts, and always be curious to learn from different people. Sometimes I come across a project whether I am interested in the music or the storyline, or the any aspect of the production of the game, for example. I'll write to the director, or I'll write to the production company. Even if there's no response, I feel like I've sent my compliment, I've sent my respect to the production process, which involves so many different talents. And I feel like someone who's able to hopefully contribute to a project, it's important to admire other people's work. So in terms of the other side of I think it's important to find your own niche. So over the years, I've been tagged as a composer who's able to write classically and symphonically. And I grew up, although classically, I have had a lot of inspiration and from the composers such as John Williams and John Barry, who usually writes in a more traditional symphonic type of way. So that's why I feel like over the years I've been briefed more from people that know my work, that have more sonically symphonic and perhaps more traditional symphonic epic way of writing, instead of the more technology electronic type of writing. So I think it's really important to find your own niche and what you can bring well to the table, instead of just blindly seek all sort of opportunities and be a composer that's seemingly writes just like anybody else. I find that there are so many music nowadays that although it sounds very impressive, that can be transferable and interchangeable almost between projects. And I think that's something to do not only in terms of composers learning from each other, but also there are cases where temp music has such an effect on people's perception on what the music should be. So nearly always as a composer, I get a temp score attached to the existing visuals or existing demos or to write to. And I find that having a temp score is very useful to get the direction perhaps where the director or designers would like the music to go towards. But there's also a danger for them to have a case they call a temp love, where they fall in love with a piece of Hans Zimmer or a piece of John Williams, and they seem to really wish to have that melody in the score, where obviously you cannot do for copyright reason or for any kind of musical reason. You cannot do that. But I find that having it's double-edged sword. There's definitely a blessing in disguise having a temp love sometimes, because you really can take something from the temp score to understand the direction to go for. I think finding a niche really is important, because for the people who always that have already knocked on the doors to seek your music, they've already found something that's special in your work, and that I usually find that to be a much smoother collaboration. That they are looking for a specific type of work that I'm able to deliver, and that usually speed up the process.
Yeah, That's great. And Tim, do you feel, I mean, generally when we're talking about networking, people find that word quite scary a lot of the time. I can never think of another more suitable word for it rather than network. We all seem to come back to that word. But having had sort of 20, 22 years in the industry, is networking and, you know, forging these relationships, maintaining them and nurturing them, is that an essential part of building a career in this industry, do you think?
Yeah, I'd certainly say it helps. It kind of depends a little bit, depending on how much you move around companies, I would say. So I myself happen to have been at just a few companies and been there for quite a while. So it's not been something that I've needed to do myself a lot because I haven't moved around. But it's definitely for people who are advancing their career, who want to work in lots of different areas, networking and just getting to know people and staying in contact with them. It can be quite useful because it can give you entrances into different companies and contacts around different areas of the world and different parts of the country, and just it helps you to find out what's going on and who might be looking for something or who might be doing a project that you might be interested in. So if you are someone who is interested in trying lots of different things, certainly networking is important. For me, for myself, it hasn't been quite so important because I've kind of stayed where I've been really, so I've not needed it so much.
And it's good to know that you can have that sort of security in the industry, as you were talking about a little bit before, but also work on a freelance basis. So from the composition and music side of things. But George, I think also you do some freelance work as well as your
yeah. I started games as a
right?
freelancer, and now I don't do much on the side now because in theory I do, but in practice not doing too much alongside a full-time job is sensible. But I started out freelancing entirely and did for 3 or 4 years or something like that. And similarly to what Tim was saying, I think actually like knowing I didn't do much of what I would think of as explicit networking, but by far and away the thing that got the best and most interesting projects was someone that I'd worked with talking to someone else. I mean, like, oh, you know, we've the word of mouth, and that's it can be an annoying thing to deal with when you don't have that, but it's not just that's what being a way of finding work. It's that those projects have also been some of the best because it's been very much like they have sought me out, and I work with my partner as well, so he sort both of us out for the things we've done. Yeah, you can get very caught up in sort of credentialing when you're applying for things openly, and that can cut both ways. So yeah, right now I'm trying to do some consulting work because that's sort of a lower time, higher impact kind of thing that fits along a full-time job without being completely exhausted. But yeah, freelancing itself was a good balance that you got to work on lots of a broader variety of things. The flip side is with all freelancing, it can be a bit feast or famine, or you feel you have to. I certainly felt early on I had to take everything. I was like, I need all the work that I can get, and then you get to the point where you have enough work and you still have that mindset, and you're just drowning in the amount of work you have to do. So I think I learned differently from freelancing. I mean, I worked on a lot of projects in different capacities in quite a short time, versus being in-house at Failbetter now. I feel like I'm learning more deeply because I'm working on the same things and with the same people for much longer. So I'm forming longer-term working relationships. I'm getting the chance. I mean, also it's a studio with a bunch of other writers and like fantastic narrative people. So learning from them directly has been really good. But the flip side is, as a freelancer as well, often we were brought in to be the lone voices to champion narrative because the studios didn't have that competency in-house, which is a great thing to do for, like, you know, backing your own expertise, because you have to come and you have to be able to make these decisions and be very articulate about it and convince people who might not understand what makes a good story, how it works, but care enough to have brought you in to do the thing, which is a good way of backing yourself. But you need to have the expertise, and then sometimes you want to actually have that validation, or just be able to turn to someone else and go, like, you know, okay, what do you think of this? Like, how do I solve this problem? So yeah, it cuts both ways.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm just keeping an eye on the time because I do want to get to audience questions. The time's flown by. So I'll just read this first question out. And some from an audience member called Chris, who says, maybe a niche question, but can you be a church musician and work well in games composition? I'm assuming it would depend on the genre. Well, I guess that's for Xiaotian.
That's an interesting question. I spent many years when I was living in Cambridge. I was the pianist and organist of the Chesterton Chorus Society, and I worked on quite a lot of accompaniment work with the choir, and I worked with the Chorus Society music director quite closely during my time, during my A-levels time. I find that it's so important to understand music theory and learn music theories from accompanying choirs, because you learn so much about harmony and counterpoint, and to be able to not improvise, but you have to you can't you're not able to read every single note of the orchestral part, for example. You learn to accompany the choir from a full score, and there's so many transferable skills in from that, and you learn so much music theories. Of course, I think there's the skills of having a thorough understanding of music theory is really important in transferring that to writing for media, and that whether that's for film or games. In terms of church musician, I think the most important thing is having a good fundamental understanding of musical theory, and so you have the skills there. And then the other side is that to be able to adapt the music technology side on top of that, then you'll be able to work with also dealing with briefs and working with people. That's all the other elements required, but certainly working with music in a church environment, for example, chorales and choirs, is definitely useful.
Thank you, Chris. I hope that's answered your question. It sounds very, very positive. Lots you can take away from the kind of technical side of actually composing music, but also the transferable skills there as well. We've got a question in here from Zuhan, I think, saying, thank you for your wonderful speech. I think that's to everybody. I'm a master's student studying psychiatry and mental health. I have been a huge fan of games for 20 years. I wonder if there will be positions for me in the gaming industry combining my background. I don't know if anyone's got some ideas about that.
I can jump in, but I think that it would be interesting to hear what everybody thinks about this question, honestly, because I feel like we're all going to think something slightly different. But yeah, that's really interesting. And I think you'd be surprised how many people come into the games industry from completely different industries and end up doing something, completely different to what they were doing before. That being said, if you were interested in incorporating your background, my instinct would be to look into something like UX, which is user experience, and then sort of choosing your projects according to things that speak to you. So there can be projects that will have a focus on something like mental health, or you can find a game or something interactive which is focusing on things like diversity and inclusion and experience, and you can get really heavy topics in games and stuff like that. So having somebody who's working in user experience or UX who has a background knowledge of those things, I can see that being like a massive asset in a role like that. But what do the others think?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think, yeah, I don't think there's like a slam dunk specific role that occupies, but as you say, like that like there are things that will take advantage of that, and there are definitely the sort of games that have specific sort of games beyond entertainment type things where they're trying to sort of showcase or dig into some specific real world thing. That there's a lot of times where they partner with experts, or either people who sort of have come across into games, or people who work still in their own fields to address that. So I can see that there, but yeah, I don't have any much more to add to that.
Anybody else, Tim?
I can add a little bit to that. I'm not something I've really thought about a lot, but what I would say, first of all, is because I've got such a long career, or it spans back 20 years, I would say the difference between when I started in games and the application of something to do with mental health or psychiatry is very different to now, where it's probably much more relevant, because games are starting to be much more complex with their narratives and deal with interesting issues. It's very much something that would not have been really considered 20 years ago, I think, but now it would be very much more important to incorporate that side and that perspective when developing anything where we're developing narratives where there are human issues at play. That's going to be interesting. But just from another side of it as well, certainly games as an industry has become much more thoughtful about its staff and its well-being of its staff, particularly where I've worked. So it's much more common these days to find a company where they're considering their staff and their staff's well-being a lot more. I know at Frontier we currently outsource a lot of that stuff, but it's something that's fairly new, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was something that was brought in-house in some of the bigger companies in the near future if it's not done already. So that might be a sort of an angle to think about.
That's really interesting. So it's not necessarily the gaming as such, but it's more about the people who are producing the games, isn't it? And the kind of staff wellbeing.
Yeah, that's
I was
right,
thinking
yeah.
also about sort of community engagement and maybe around that side of things in terms of engaging with the gamers. And I don't know a huge amount about it, obviously, but that is,
being a
quite
community manager takes it tends to be, I mean, it takes a certain type of person, I would say, to be a community manager, and it kind of depends on how you feel about social media and just massive social media engagement as well in general, because you just tend to have to be chronically online to be something like a community manager. But yeah, as you said, so I've worked at Epic Games and now I'm working at EA, which are both like absolutely ginormous companies, and behind the scenes of making the games we have pillars of pastoral and financial and so many different structures that are in place to take care of the employees. So yeah, I'm sure that there are so many roles in there for anybody who's seeking. I mean, even think if you have aspirations to be an accountant, you could be an accountant at a games company. You could be a lawyer at a games company. Like every games company I've worked at has had lawyers, and they're very important. So it's worth considering. You don't need to be a game maker to work at a game studio.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We'll just move on to another question. Thank you, everyone. From Natasha, what's the application or interview process like for writers specifically? And also, what would class as a good work experience for CV? So it's the interview process and application process for writers, and then more about what does good work experience look like, or what does it look like on your CV?
Yeah, I think most roles I've looked at, part of it will be completely expected and typical in that there may or may not be a screening conversation with the recruiter, and then there's been 1+ further interviews, usually sort of 2 or 3. That's the sort of typical bit. There's some roles have writing tests, which I'll talk about in a second, and I have opinions on. But generally, the expectation, I think, would be that either as part of an application or at some stage earlier on in that process, you would submit a portfolio of some kind. And that's something that the longer you work in the industry, sometimes you can get portfolio pieces from things you actually worked on that are in shipped games. That's not a guarantee either, because sometimes you're not contractually allowed to share those pieces even if they are in the game somewhere. But usually if it's out in the public, you can then use that kind of thing. But until you have that, you're still kind of expected to show something, which can be quite tricky to sort of, you've got to make up an entire game and kind of write one little piece of it so you can showcase that. That is a thing you could do. There's a I think this is publicly available. Limit Break, who do a mentoring program for various people in games. There's a talk last year, on preparing a portfolio with Giles Armstrong. I can probably find that link afterwards, which has I kind of covered a lot of those questions as to how you go about this, because a lot of it is just making up an excuse for yourself to write. Here's a bunch of buck writing, here's a bunch of cinematic writing, just something that you can have as a showcase for what you can do, and hopefully you can augment that over time with stuff that you ship. Writing tests are sort of common. They'll often, which a writing test is like, they'll give you a bespoke assignment and say, go away and do this and give us the results, and we will then use that to evaluate how good a writer we think you are. I think they do have a place, but often companies do them sort of by default, and they're actually not very good at answering the question, and they just cause a lot of work. Like, if you're giving 50 applicants a writing test that's going to take them between an hour and a day or more. I've done writing tests that have been multiple days of my time where I've not been getting paid for other things. That I think that companies should be more responsible than that, or at least do it for the final few candidates if you really need to make a decision. I think a lot of times it comes down to the company struggling to assess what good writing looks like, or really, really, really trying. They want to know that someone can write their exact game exactly like that, which also is artificial, because whenever you come on a new project, you've got to learn how to write the game. That's a different thing that a good writer can triangulate towards. They are, I think, somewhat inescapable in certain contexts, particularly if you're newer to the industry, because you have less clout, and B, you're less likely to have sort of defensible portfolio stuff. So I think it's more acceptable for junior roles, but I do put those caveats attached to it, where I think companies should be better about handling them. But that is something that I think would be, I would not say to juniors that you can get away with just refusing to do them, but also be aware that they come at a cost. They often put the work onto candidates in a sort of unscalable way. In terms of experience, I think make stuff is the key thing. Like, you should be writing these, you should be making games. The game jam, like, people often advise to do game jams. I think that's a really good idea. So there's off the top of my head, there's, for instance, Ink Jam. Ink is a sort of narrative scripting language. I think that happens most years in October. I haven't done that for a while. There's various sort of interactive fiction competitions, and there's this sort of game jams happening all the time with different themes. And that is a point where you'll spend either a weekend or some bounded amount of time making a game with other people. If you're keen, you can develop the skills to sort of make something very small and solo, like the tools around ink and stuff. You can technically make that just mostly using the writing side and very little else. I will say that lots of that is a good thing to do, and it's good to get into the practice of knowing how a thing is made end to end. But I won't overpromise and say that that's a thing that will move the needle by itself on a CV, because obviously lots of people are doing that, and there's a difference, I think, between making things commercially and getting used to the sensibilities of a project that is making decisions that are based around money. But if you make a thing in a game jam, you're making a thing to a deadline and you can ship it and you can show that you've done it. So I think make your own stuff, like look at tools like Ink or Twine or other things that let you just, with a minimum of learning, start making something, even if it's bad or even if it's not what you want it to be. Finish things, because it's better to make something and finish it and it be bad and then make something else than it is to say, I will make this perfect and spend a lot of time polishing it and have nothing to show for it. So I think just get used to iterating and showing those things.
And to the rest of you, or to all of you, because we had a couple of questions about experience and people saying that often gaming companies requiring a lot of relevant experience beforehand. Is it enough to build your own experience, as in to do your own projects in your own time, or do you have to get experience with a particular organisation? What's going to look particularly effective on a CV if you're just starting out in those entry roles?
It's quite an interesting question. I'll try and answer it as best I can, I suppose. I would say, from where we're coming from and what I think about when I'm thinking about employing someone, if I'm looking for someone from a graduate role, then I'm not so concerned about experience per se. What I'm concerned about, well, really, portfolio is key for a lot of creative industries. So if you can demonstrate talent and skill, that is something that will catch my eye immediately. And then if you're someone who is willing to put in time and effort to demonstrate that they're tenacious, they want to go out and try and produce something and have a go, and are able to talk about where they've succeeded and where they've failed, then I can see that that's someone who is trying to get experience, and therefore I want to give them the opportunity to have it. So I hope that kind of makes sense. But yeah, but also, seeing that someone's got an experience on their CV is good, but it would generally be more for higher roles, I would say. So where we tend to look for employees, we do have graduate roles where we try to bring people in who are quite early in their careers and build them up and give them experience and mentor them and teach them the skills that we want them to have. So for that, I would say experience much less important. Where as you go through your career, it becomes very important towards the top.
I just wanted to also touch on one question that's come in, just to say, would you say, again, on the experience side of things, would you say that most entry-level jobs in the industry require some sort of practical skills like modelling or animating? And how or what kind of positions can people without these kinds of trainings get into the industry? I don't know if I'm not sure if that's aimed at you particularly, Tim, or at the animation side of things.
I can speak to it first if you like, and then we could pass it to everyone else. So yeah, if you're interested in getting to the games industry but you don't have the skills for it yet, then I would recommend, well, from an animation perspective, there's all sorts of ways in which you can gain skills. So there are lots of online courses out there that you can do remotely, being mentored from people in the industry who will teach you a lot of the skills you need. There are lots of games courses out there, university courses, which will give you a grounding and give you the opportunity to build up your skills. There's a lots of opportunity these days to be able to just pick things up and have a go and just tinker around and play and see what you're interested in. The internet is a great resource these days for finding people who are online who can give you little hints and tips. In fact, I use that quite a lot myself, even as someone who's quite experienced. I'll go onto the old faithful Google and see what people have done and use that as a springboard for some of my work. So yeah, there's lots of opportunities for gaining skills for animation, certainly. Hope that answers the question.
Anybody else have some tips for that one?
I can speak to the modelling portion of the question. So from the perspective of a 3D artist, 3D modeler, and for context, for 3D modeling, you know, I'm a character artist, but we also have things like environment artists, props modelers. Like there's lots of different facets to 3D modeling, and many of those people are not like university educated in 3D modeling. Many are actually completely self-taught. So I just jotted down a few resources that if you are interested in getting into something like 3D modeling, then you might want to start having a look at websites like ArtStation, which is a portfolio uploading website and is actually the industry standard for 3D modelers in the games industry. So that would be your first port of call, to look at a website like ArtStation and think, is this something I'm interested in? Would I like to be making artwork like this? Is this something that I could see myself doing and having a good time? And then if you were considering then taking that a bit further and starting the process of teaching yourself, you can do things like the Gnomon workshop has a lot of excellent entry-level courses that you can do. Those are paid for, as are ArtStation Learning. But if you wanted to try it out because you're not sure, I would recommend downloading Blender, which is a completely free piece of 3D modeling software, and then going on the Blender website or YouTube and just typing in Blender free tutorial, because you can learn 3D modeling completely from scratch using a completely free piece of software, just by looking up Blender tutorials and using Blender. It's actually incredible that it's all completely free. But if you are looking to getting into modeling, that's what I would recommend.
That's great, thank you. I'm just keeping on the time. We've only got sort of 5 minutes or so left, and I do want to go to a question that's come in, which is one I was going to ask as well, actually, funnily enough, from Oliver. He says, sorry to address an elephant in the room. How has AI impacted your work, in brackets if at all, specifically in regards to video game music? Could it be a useful tool for improving workflow, helping with mixing, mastering, for example? So Shasha, if we start with you, and then I'm very interested to know how AI is sort of impacting, changing the way you will work, if at all.
Yes, so I find that with music technology advancing every day with AI, the barriers to entry seem to be lower and lower for people just getting started. There's so much information on how to write music or using existing technology to create chord progressions or generate melodies, and there's ready-made tools which you can arrange musical ideas to become and glue it together to make your own music pieces. But I find that's the most important thing in working with game developers or film directors is actually the collaboration side of the music creation. And I think it's so important when I mentioned the word nurture, is not only nurturing between the collaborators, but also nurturing with trust and how understanding how people work together. You can so I used to use tools that mastered my music from time to time, but I found that having the control over what you do is the most important thing. And I find that if you do have the skills to have the understanding of musical foundations and theory, and you are able to understand the chord progressions and understand the instrumentation, how to write for instruments, I think it's always useful and recommended, in my opinion, to have that control over, because there's so many controlling factors already, restrictions. For example, writing for games, you're always trying to find the missing puzzle in how to find the loop point of the music, how to find the layers, making sure the music's not too boring after repeated about 5,000 times. If the player got stuck in a level, making sure the music is engaging enough whilst not taking too much attention from the story. I feel these kind of things are there's still a lot there's a lot of room to grow for AI to take over the human composers or collaboration to make me feel like that it's going to really dramatically affect my workflow. And I feel that you can, if you do feel there are elements in your work that requires certain uplift. For example, you can, of course, using existing sample libraries, which sometimes just in terms of timing, you need additional phrases or loops just to bulk up the workflow. But I find it's really important, and there's always ways. It's better to have the control under your fingertips musically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Does anybody else have some ideas about AI?
I have many opinions, most of them negative. No, I think like there is like the capabilities are generally a bit overhyped in terms of the general applicability. I think there's like tons of really specific parts of workflows where generative tools will be really, really useful. That's already how like we integrate technology like that all the time. But the thing is, if you can't talk like that where it's solving really, really specific niche pipeline problems, because that's not how you get billions of dollars invested in your chatbot company. Like, so there's sort of this myth that it's like inevitable and generalizable. It's not that it's useless either. There's some really specific things that it can do really well. But when I've experimented it on my own projects, like writing fundamentally isn't a text generation problem. Like there's all the other stuff that I talked about I'm doing, and that is the bulk of it. Yes, sometimes writing a first draft is the most painful bit. It's tedious, annoying, and it always sucks. And I've never found a way of improving that. But even when I tried on my own time using tools to like skip the head of that bit, it was just much worse, because that's still fun through the pain. It's still actually like fun to do that kind of thing. And part of doing it badly and stressfully is then when I look at it, I go, cool, okay, right, I know this thing inside and out, and I can actually turn it into something good. And if I skip that bit, while that technically would be a sort of emotional time saving, because I'm not having to go through that pulling teeth bit, I then just don't have the handle on the work. I have to actually approach it from scratch in that kind of way. Again, I think Ubisoft have a Bark generator. So Bark's a very sort of small, oft-repeated lines of dialogue that often serve a functional purpose. Like in a shooter game, it might be an NPC says like, I'm reloading, or something like that communicates state information to the player. They're going to hear them a lot, so you need a lot of variation. So every time an NPC reloads, if you have one voice recording of an NPC saying, I'm reloading, the player will hate them, but if they hear that like time and time again. So you need like 80 different ways of saying I'm reloading. And that's like infamously the worst part of the game's writing job, is like, cool, I need to come up with 80 ways of saying the same thing in about 6 words that are also characterable. And that's the kind of part where actually, using some kind of generative text tool to augment that. And Ubisoft made an in-house tool that worked that way, where you could give it an input and produce an output. That's solving a specific problem, but it's not going to sort of remove. What does bother me is it's potentially an existential threat if executives think they can use it as a way of de-skilling or delegitimizing specialist skills like writing other things, while still being dependent on them to make it good. Like if you can get the AI to spit something out, you still need a really skilled editor to make that actually good, but you can pay them less because they're not doing the writing. Like that's the thing that bothers me, is the risk of it as a kind of a tool against labor. But it's much nicher, I think, in its applicability than people are being told anyway. Soapbox off.
Yeah, I could add to that a little bit. Certainly from our experience, I would say AI as it is now is not so much of an impact on our industry. We've tried it to do a few things like cloth simulation and little bits and pieces, and it's not really come to fruition. However, it's certainly very interesting, and I would say unpredictable, and the speed at which it's improving in terms of asset creation is really quite alarming and incredible. So I suppose I could see down the line we could be in a place where a lot of actual asset work is, if not done by AI, but it might be sort of a springboard to get you someplace where you can then hone it. But I would say that the human judgment part for appeal and understanding human experience to steer AI in the right direction, I would say that is probably somewhere quite a long way off, and maybe somewhere where the people using AI, that's where their skill set would be, so the human judgment side of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I would kind of repeat that right now I don't think it has had much impact really for us, but certainly I can see not in the far distant future it being something that's has quite an impact. Yeah.
Do you think it's a skill that people are going to have to need to develop, or certainly beyond an awareness of what's involved with AI, to be, can be more successful in applications for roles and things like that?
You mean developing AI itself, or using AI
just as a candidate for a job? Do you think it's a skill that people are going to need to start developing, knowing how to use AI? And
I suspect it was something that will happen naturally, where people will be using tools that are created to to get the finished article a lot more.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if it's something that you'd sort of have to sort of venture in particularly to understand, because tools will naturally envelop and develop AI to be part of the tool set, and then you as a user of that tool would naturally start to understand them and develop your own skills with it. But as I was saying, like, if you're a creative person, then the side of your job where you're trying to appeal to people and create things which people love, that side of things I think is just less applicable to AI, certainly at the moment. But you know, who knows what will happen in the future.
Yeah. Indeed, thank you. I think we have just gone slightly over our time, but that, unless anyone's got any other questions, that was a wonderful session, really, really interesting. And thank you so much for talking so insightfully and transparently about what you do. But thank you so much to all our panelists, Georgia, Xiaotian, George and Tim, for taking your time tonight to come and talk to us all. It was really valuable. And thank you very much.